The winter wind tapped insistently at the old glass windows of Harvard's mathematics building, its chill creeping through the cracks like a ghost trying to be heard. Inside, under the buzz of a flickering overhead light, Professor Gerald Whitmore stood motionless. His office was a dim museum of long nights and longer regrets, coffee-stained journals, towers of paper, and chalk dust that never really left the air. A mug of untouched coffee sat growing cold beside a paper he should have already submitted. The final question on the exam stared back at him from the page. Simple. Elegant. Unforgiving. Collat's conjecture. He muttered the name under his breath like it was a curse. For decades, it had floated through mathematical circles as a whisper, never appearing on official exams, always discussed with a smirk and a shrug. It wasn't unsolvable, they said. It was untamable. The conjecture had a strange way of devouring those who dared chase it. It didn't yield answers. It demanded obsession. Gerald had only included it in the draft as a statement, a dare. But now, in the dying light of Thursday evening, he hesitated. This wasn't just another problem. It was a test of the soul. He could see it scaring students off the minute they turned the page. Not because it was unfair, but because it was honest. Brutally so. No one's going to touch this, he whispered, almost to himself. It'll break them. He rubbed his temples, already regretting his choice. The page felt heavier in his hand than paper should. He walked to the recycling bin, paused, and crumpled the sheet with a force that felt personal. Like erasing a version of himself that had once believed in impossible beauty. The sound it made as it hit the bottom was soft, but final. In that quiet moment, something shifted. But Whitmore didn't hear it. He had already turned away. 3 floors below, under the hum of old radiators and echoing janitorial footsteps, a different kind of storm was gathering. Ellie Moore, 14, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and sneakers whose soles had long given up, moved silently down the hallway. She had no student ID, no right to be inside these corridors. Yet she moved like she belonged. Harvard wasn't her school, it was her secret. She knew which lights flickered, which doors stuck, and which professors left the best paper scraps in their bins. Ellie had been helping her grandmother, Ruth, clean classrooms for nearly a year now. Not because she was asked. Not because anyone knew. But because she'd seen eviction notices and the worry behind Ruth's tired eyes. And because something about these cold marble halls made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible. Her job tonight was simple: collect cardboard and paper to sell by the pound. That's when she found it. The bin outside room 314 wasn't full. Just a few papers sat on top. One was crumpled, clean, printed on thick, university-grade paper. Something about it made her stop. She smoothed it out on her thigh. Words danced before her eyes. An equation, or rather, a rule. If the number is even, divide it by 2. If it's odd, multiply it by 3 and add 1. Repeat. She read it again. Then a third time. Something in her mind clicked, not like a light bulb, but like a drawer being slowly opened, revealing something she hadn't known was there. This wasn't just a problem. It was alive. She didn't know the name Collat's conjecture. She didn't need to. She remembered a tattered math book she'd once found in a donation bin, its pages brittle, the cover half missing. That book had shown her how numbers could dance. How they collapsed, spun, and pulsed like music. She'd experimented with them for hours on torn notebook paper, not to solve anything, just to watch how they moved. Now this rule on Harvard letterhead was like a message sent straight to her. Ellie crouched next to the bin and pulled out a flattened cereal box from her backpack. She placed the paper on top and began to sketch, not with numbers, but with motion. Arrows. Loops, curves. She drew where numbers fell, where they soared. Some spiraled in violently, others zigzagged wildly before folding in. Yet they all arrived at the same breathless end. She whispered to herself, almost reverently, "They all come home." She didn't hear the cleaning carts rolling down the hall. She didn't notice the lights dimming as the building switched to night mode. Ellie was lost. Not the kind of lost you fear, but the kind you chase. Her pen moved like a conductor's baton. Her mind didn't shout, it listened. And in the listening, it began to hear something extraordinary. Somewhere, beneath all the rules and loops, there was a rhythm. A shape inside the chaos. She circled a point. Then again. Again. That same point. Always, the paths passed through it. Why? She didn't know. But it felt ancient. Older than numbers. Older than buildings. It felt real. And she was touching it. Behind her, down the corridor, a voice called softly, "Ellie. You ready?" Ruth's voice. Grounding. Gentle. Ellie folded the paper like it was sacred and tucked it into her bag. She turned to look back once more at the recycling bin. The place where something brilliant had almost been lost forever. She smiled, not the smile of someone who understood everything, but the smile of someone who just realized they had a key, and now they needed to find the door. That night, as the city lights blinked through the windows of their tiny apartment above a laundromat, Ruth hummed a lullaby Ellie didn't recognize. The apartment smelled of chamomile tea and old floorboards. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, unfolding the page again. She didn't try to solve it. Not yet. Instead, she wrote a single question on a blank sheet beside it. Why do they all end the same way? She didn't know the answer. But she knew the world had thrown away that question, and tonight, she had picked it back up. By the time morning lit up the rooftops of Cambridge, the paper Ellie had rescued lay flattened on the desk she'd built from an old crate and a cracked tabletop. She hadn't slept. Not because she didn't want to, but because her mind refused to let go of the rhythm buried in those lines. Something in the rule pulsed with life. It wasn't just math, it was a map. Ruth knocked once before entering, holding a chipped mug. "Chamomile, again," she said softly, eyes catching the pile of sketches beside Ellie. "You're deep into something." Ellie nodded, her fingers tracing one of the spirals she'd drawn. "It's like it wants to be understood," she murmured. Ruth set the tea down, didn't press further. She never did. She knew that sometimes Ellie needed silence more than answers. That morning, Ellie walked back into Harvard not as a janitor's granddaughter, not as a stray in borrowed corridors, but as a hunter of patterns, searching for the next clue. She slipped into the building as the first students filtered in. Her hoodie hid her face. Her silence shielded her. No one stopped her. No one noticed. And that suited her perfectly. She didn't go to the classroom her grandmother was scheduled to clean. She turned left instead, toward the hallway that held room 203. The seminar room. The one with the full chalkboard across the wall. The one she'd claimed as her own in the hours no one watched. Her steps were light, her breath steady. She knew the timing now, when the custodial staff passed, when the motion sensors blinked. Ellie moved like someone who had never been invited, but had learned how to stay anyway. She pushed the door open gently. Inside, the air was still. Chalk dust shimmered faintly in the sunlight slicing through tall windows. She exhaled slowly and stepped forward, the room greeting her like a secret that had missed her. She reached into her bag, pulled out her diagrams, and unrolled them across the table. Then, slowly, reverently, she began to sketch on the board again. Not the same paths. New ones. Larger numbers. She traced their journey, not just the values, but the way they behaved. One dipped and surged violently before spiraling inward. Another seemed to hesitate, twist, and then crash into the same convergence point. She called it the hinge. The place numbers seemed to breathe before disappearing into silence. It wasn't just repetition, it was choreography. And something inside her said that if she could map the entire system, she would find more than math. Maybe truth. Maybe design. Maybe something left behind by those who saw before her. She didn't know yet. But she felt the gravity of it. And it made her bold. As she drew, her thoughts moved faster than her hand. What if this was more than a pattern? What if this was a message? One that no one else had thought to interpret because they'd all been so obsessed with solving it, so focused on arriving, they'd missed the shape of the journey itself. Her chalk froze in mid-air as that thought struck her. What if solving it had never been the point? What if the question was never meant to be answered, but followed? A sudden noise outside the door made her freeze. A cartwheel squeaked against tile. Voices passed. Then silence again. Ellie exhaled, returned to her work. Her eyes scanned the board. Shapes nested inside shapes. Paths intersected like veins in a body. She circled 3 of the convergence points, then paused. All 3 different sequences. All passed through the same location. She added a symbol beside them. Not a number, not a letter. A mark. Something she'd made up. She didn't need a language for others. She needed one for herself. A personal lexicon to capture something too slippery for standard math. As the sun climbed higher, Ellie packed up again. Her fingers were coated in white dust. She folded her sketches with care, tucked the chalk into her pocket, and slipped out the way she came in. No one noticed. No one stopped her. But somewhere inside that building, something had changed. The path had begun to bend. Back in her apartment that evening, Ruth placed a newspaper beside Ellie's bowl of soup. "You made it into the crossword," she said casually. Ellie blinked. "What?" Ruth pointed. "Number 16, it climbs, it falls, it always returns." Ellie's handwriting, sent on a whim, a joke, a secret dare to the universe. And the paper had printed it. She stared at it for a long time, a flicker of something rising in her chest. It wasn't pride. Not yet. It was recognition. Something or someone was starting to hear her. Across campus, in a quiet corner office filled with the low hum of regret, Professor Whitmore sat rereading the entrance exam draft. Again. The spot where the final question had been, the blank space, kept pulling at him. Not visually. Spiritually. He had thrown it out, yes. But something gnawed at the edge of his mind. A question. A possibility. What if someone had found it? He shook his head, dismissing the absurdity. Still, the thought stuck. And it stayed. The page had vanished into the trash, but the equation lived on in the mind of a girl no one was looking for. And what she was building in silence, with chalk and instinct, was more than math. It was a mirror. One the world wasn't ready to see. Not yet. Ellie couldn't remember the last time she had eaten breakfast without her mind tangled in shapes. That Saturday morning, as Ruth stirred oatmeal in a chipped saucepan, Ellie sat at the table with a marker in one hand and a blank page spread before her like untouched snow. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster, then stopped, only to begin again in a different corner. She wasn't calculating. She was listening. Somewhere beneath the loops and steps of numbers, there was music. Not the kind you could hear with your ears, but the kind that played on bone and breath and memory. Every number she touched seemed to carry a different rhythm, like dancers spinning across a floor they didn't choose but couldn't help but follow. Some dove quickly, vanishing into convergence like a sigh. Others resisted, flaring upward before folding in on themselves. No two moved the same way, but they all obeyed the same rules. That contradiction fascinated her. Ellie had never liked the way people talked about math, as cold, rigid, logical. She didn't see logic when she watched the sequences unfold. She saw yearning. Tension. Collapse. Grace. There was a sadness to it, too. Like watching a bird try to escape a room with no windows. She wondered if anyone else had ever felt that. Probably not. Not the way she did. What's it look like today? Ruth asked softly, placing a bowl in front of her. Ellie looked up, her eyes a little too bright for morning. Like a storm that doesn't want to be a storm. Like a story that ends before it's finished. Ruth smiled in that way only grandmothers can, half pride, half ache. That's a lot to see in numbers. They're not just numbers, Ellie said quietly. They're trying to tell us something. Ruth didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her silence was a kind of trust. Ellie left early that day, her bag packed with sketches, chalk, and an old cereal box she'd flattened for drawing. Harvard on weekends was slower, softer. She slipped through the side entrance and took the stairs 2 at a time. Room 203 welcomed her like a cathedral built of dust and echo. She closed the door behind her and stared at the board. Yesterday's drawings were gone. Someone had wiped it clean. But not carelessly. The erasure had been precise. Respectful. Someone had seen her work, and hadn't destroyed it. That meant someone was watching. Ellie's heart didn't race. It slowed. Deepened. This wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. She stepped forward and began to draw. This time, she didn't start with a rule. She started with motion. She picked a number, 27, and let it move. Divide. Multiply. Add. Collapse. Loop. Each step she translated into curves, lines, intersections. She added color using pieces of chalk she'd saved for weeks. Red for fall, blue for rise, yellow for pause. The sequence curled into itself, paused near the hinge, then dove again. Ellie circled the hinge. Then another. And another. She stepped back. The board looked like a map of something alive, a nervous system, a constellation, a memory. The shapes weren't random. They were deliberate. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from awareness. She wasn't creating something. She was uncovering it. Like an archaeologist brushing dust from an ancient truth. The room was so quiet she could hear her own breath. It made the chalk louder, the scratching more electric. She boxed in a region where 3 paths crossed again and again. She called it the lattice. It felt like a heartbeat, pulsing beneath everything. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it mattered. A knock startled her. Soft, tentative. She froze. No one knocked here. Not on weekends. Not on this room. She didn't move. The knock didn't come again. Minutes passed. She stepped to the door and opened it just a crack. No one was there. But down the hallway, at the end near the stairwell, a shadow moved. Tall. Still. Watching. Then gone. Ellie shut the door gently, locked it, and returned to the board. But her hand wouldn't move. She stood there, staring at what she'd made. For the first time, it felt fragile. Exposed. And yet, part of her was glad. Someone else had seen. And they hadn't erased it. They'd made space. That night, she sat in bed, the paper from the trash beside her, now worn soft from folding. She copied the rule again, this time slower. Her handwriting had changed. She wasn't rushing toward understanding anymore. She was walking with it. Each curve felt different. Each angle a whisper. She thought of the hinge. Of the lattice. Of the way numbers breathed. She wrote one sentence beneath it all: what if they're not numbers at all? What if they're memories? The next morning, Ellie skipped breakfast. Her stomach didn't care. She needed answers. She needed to see how far the sequences could go before the patterns dissolved. She returned to room 203. This time, she brought glue and tape. She mounted her drawings on the back wall. She didn't care who saw. Not anymore. She drew fast. Hard. Deep. Circling, looping, marking places where motion paused. She labeled one, grief. Another, release. She wasn't solving. She was feeling. By midday, her fingers were raw. Her arms ached. But the board was alive. That was when Professor Gerald Whitmore passed by room 203 on his way to retrieve a forgotten journal. The door was locked, but a sliver of light spilled out from beneath. He paused, listening. Inside, chalk moved like breath. And something in his chest, something buried long ago, stirred. He didn't knock. Not yet. He walked away, but he couldn't stop thinking about the sound. Ellie, inside, didn't hear him. She was too deep inside the dance. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to belong. She was trying to remember something she'd never been taught. Something the world had forgotten how to see. By the time Monday arrived, Ellie had memorized the sound of every hallway echo, every footstep outside room 203, every creak of the radiator when it kicked to life. This room wasn't just a space anymore, it was a sanctuary, a page in the middle of a book only she could read. When she slipped through the door just after 6 that morning, the lights were still dim, the world outside still half asleep. She stood in front of the chalkboard, now nearly full, her work from the weekend wrapping across the walls in swirling paths and strange symbols. But she didn't feel pride. Not exactly. What she felt was closer to reverence, like she was tending something sacred. She whispered, "Let's see what you become today," and began to draw again. Today, she wouldn't focus on the numbers. Today, she'd watch how they collided. She picked 3 sequences she hadn't traced before and sent them moving, through halves and triples, additions and loops, mapping their trails not by value, but by trajectory. 2 spun outward, touched the same arc, then fell inward again. 1 moved erratically, stalling near the lattice before falling fast. Ellie paused, then boxed the point where all 3 had passed. She wrote 1 word beside it. Memory. As her hand moved faster, her body stilled. Her breathing evened. It felt like the room itself was holding its breath with her. Then something unexpected happened. The chalk in her fingers snapped. Not loudly. Just enough to jolt her out of the trance. She looked down at her hand, white dust across her fingertips, a smear on her sleeve, and realized she was trembling. Not from fear, but from recognition. This was more than math. She was chasing something older than equations. Something alive. She backed away slowly from the board, looking at the growing complexity. She had drawn dozens of paths, all starting differently, yet nearly all circling back to the same set of points. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like gravity. She whispered, "Why do they always come back here?" and sat cross-legged in the middle of the room. She pulled her notebook into her lap and flipped to a clean page. This time, instead of numbers or sketches, she wrote a single question. "What does it want from me?" The silence in the room didn't answer, but it didn't feel empty either. It felt watchful. That was when Whitmore returned. He hadn't planned to. He wasn't scheduled for anything in this wing. But something about Friday's moment, standing outside room 203, hearing chalk move like a heart, had embedded itself in him. He told himself he'd just walk by. That was all. Just a glance. But when he reached the hallway and found the door closed, he didn't turn away. He stepped closer, slowly. He pressed one hand lightly to the door. Listened. No sound. Not even breathing. He bent slightly and peered through the sliver between the door and the frame. What he saw froze him in place. Diagrams, sprawling across the walls like a storm system. Symbols he didn't recognize. Sequences in motion, alive on the board. And in the center, a girl, young, too young to belong here, surrounded by sketches, lost in thought, completely unaware of the world outside. Whitmore didn't open the door. He stepped back, heart thudding, mind spinning. Who was she? A student? No. He'd have seen her name, heard her voice. But there was no record of her. No notes. No permissions. And yet, she had taken hold of one of the most terrifying problems in mathematics, and turned it into music. He walked away quickly, not because he didn't want to see more, but because it unsettled something in him. She had found a truth he had been too afraid to chase. And she had done it alone. That night, Ellie felt different. Not because of anything on the board, but because she sensed the shift. Someone had seen. Someone had walked the edge of her silence and chosen not to disturb it. That meant she had been real to them. Not a myth. Not a whisper. A presence. She unfolded a fresh page and drew the lattice again, slower this time. She added an extra line, one that hadn't been there before. A path that moved sideways, interrupted the hinge, bent through it like a key sliding into a lock. She didn't know why she added it. Only that it felt like the right place to hide something important. Like a door only one other person might try to open. Then, just beneath it, in small, careful script, she wrote, "What happens if it listens back?" The apartment was quiet when she returned home. Ruth had already gone to bed. Ellie stood in the hallway for a long moment, still wrapped in the day. Then she walked to the window, looked out over the laundromat's parking lot, and whispered into the glass, "You saw me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Somewhere in the maze of Harvard, someone had looked, and not turned away. And even if they never spoke, even if they never showed themselves again, it changed everything. Because now, she wasn't alone. The next morning arrived with a strange weight. The city still buzzed, the traffic still grumbled past the windows of Ellie's apartment, but she moved through the noise like it couldn't reach her. Something had shifted inside her, subtle but irreversible. She hadn't solved anything, not in the way math demanded, but she had felt something click, like a knot loosening after being tight for years. As she zipped up her hoodie and tucked her sketchbook under her arm, Ruth handed her a small folded bag with lunch. "Don't stay too late," she said gently, though she knew she would. Ellie just nodded. She couldn't explain why she had to go back, only that the room was calling. At Harvard, the halls were louder than usual. Midterms were approaching. Professors barked questions, students muttered formulas, printers spat out doomed essays. But Ellie didn't hear any of it. She slid through the side door and followed the path her feet had memorized. Up the stairs, past the west corridor, second left. Room 203. She unlocked it with the little tool she kept hidden in her sleeve. The room greeted her with stillness. The chalkboard stood waiting, her diagrams untouched. But that wasn't what caught her eye. On the table in the back corner, where she had left nothing, was a single folded note. No name. No handwriting she recognized. Just 5 words, "What are you looking for?" Her heart thudded once, loud and deep. She stared at the note, then scanned the room. Nothing else. No sounds. No footsteps. But she knew it hadn't come from Ruth. And it hadn't floated in by accident. Someone had left it here. For her. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. She walked straight to the board and picked up the chalk. Today, she wasn't just drawing sequences. She was chasing a ghost. She selected one of the more violent paths, one that spiraled chaotically before collapsing near the hinge. She traced it, not with numbers, but with motion, quick sweeps, jagged angles, a sudden drop. She circled the sharpest bend. Labeled it, breaking point. Then she picked another sequence. One that started slow but accelerated unpredictably, like a fire catching wind. It curved, hesitated, then surged across the board. She mapped it beside the first and realized, both paths, despite their chaos, touched the same three regions. Lattice. Hinge. Divergence. She stepped back. Her breath caught in her chest. They weren't following formulas. They were following terrain. It wasn't math. It was geography. Ellie dropped the chalk and grabbed her sketchbook. She flipped to a blank page and began to redraw the three zones, lattice as a cluster of intersections, hinge as a smooth bend, divergence as a point where paths fractured. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she could feel it. The shapes weren't just results of a rule. They were artifacts of something deeper. Something that didn't just calculate, it chose. Numbers didn't behave this way. People did. Outside the room, Whitmore stood in the hallway, staring at the door. He hadn't planned to return. But again, something had pulled him here. A sense that something important was happening just beyond his reach. He hadn't told anyone. Not the other faculty. Not the department head. He wasn't ready to share what he had seen, or more accurately, what he had felt. Because logic didn't explain what he was witnessing. Emotion did. Intuition did. And Whitmore, for all his years in academia, had nearly forgotten what intuition felt like. He reached into his coat and pulled out another note. This one read, "There's a reason they all return." He hesitated, then slid it under the door. Inside, Ellie didn't see it immediately. She was deep in the lattice again, tracing how one sequence veered off course only to return 3 steps later, like it had been pulled back by a thread. She felt something under her shoe and bent down. The second note. She opened it, read the line, and for a moment just stood there, holding it in trembling fingers. It was her thought. The same one she'd whispered days ago. They all come home. Whoever was leaving these messages, they weren't just watching. They were listening. She walked to the board, erased a section at the top, and wrote a new heading in bold white chalk, "What pulls them back?" Then, just below it, she added a symbol she'd only recently begun to use, an open spiral, one that never closed. A symbol of return without repetition. Something that comes back but is never quite the same. A moment later, she heard the soft sound of a door closing down the hallway. She ran to the door and opened it wide. Empty. Just the echo of a step. But she smiled. Because she didn't feel alone anymore. Not truly. There was a rhythm now. A pattern hidden in the silence. Ellie didn't know the name of the person out there. But she knew something deeper. They understood. And that made all the difference. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the heater clicking in rhythm with the wind against the windows, her fingers still twitching as if gripping chalk. The 2 notes she'd found were tucked under her pillow, their presence like a heartbeat beside her. She didn't need to reread them. She'd memorized every letter, every spacing, even the slight pressure marks where the writer had pressed down too hard. They weren't just messages. They were invitations. Someone had seen her maps, understood the dance of the numbers, and responded, not with explanations, not with questions, but with a mirror. A reflection of thought. A conversation in symbols. The next morning, she rose before dawn. The city outside was still half asleep, draped in fog, but Ellie moved through it like a spark slipping through wire. Ruth watched her pack extra chalk, more sketches, even an extra notebook. "Is it happening?" she asked gently. Ellie hesitated. "Something is," she said finally. "I think someone's talking back." Ruth nodded once, then handed her a thermos. "Then make sure you answer." At Harvard, Ellie didn't head straight for room 203. Instead, she took a detour to the architecture library. She'd never been inside before, students needed IDs, but she waited until a group of grad students exited and slipped through before the door closed. The space smelled of dust and wood polish, and it was quiet in a way that made every step feel sacred. She found a section on flow mapping, on visualizing motion, rivers, architecture of bridges, the way energy passed through space. She wasn't looking for definitions. She was looking for resonance. Symbols. Shapes. Anything that matched what she'd drawn. On page 78 of a book with a torn cover, she found it. Not a solution, something better. A diagram from an old city plan, showing how 3 sewer lines converged into a single chamber before being redirected. The description called it the catchment. Her breath caught. That was what her hinge had been all along. A place where paths pooled. Not ended. Just gathered. She copied it carefully into her notebook, then wrote beneath it, catchment equals hinge equals memory point. She added a second thought. Not where things die. Where they remember. She left the library without checking the book out. She didn't need it anymore. She had the shape in her mind. She reached room 203 just as the sun broke over the rooftops. The door was unlocked. Not unusual, she sometimes left it that way now. But what was new was the object sitting on the desk. A piece of cardboard. Folded. No note this time. No writing. Just a drawing. A spiral. Hers. But mirrored. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't hers. But it was someone else who had understood what she was trying to say. She unfolded the cardboard. On the inside were 3 arrows. Not numbers. Just directions. Each one pointed to a quadrant of the board where she'd marked key intersections. The hinge. The lattice. The divergence. Beneath the final arrow, one word, why. She stepped back from the board and felt it all at once, the accumulation of days spent drawing, listening, wondering. She wasn't ahead of the problem anymore. She was inside it. It was no longer her map. It was their map. Hers and the ghost on the other side of the wall. She picked up the chalk and began to trace the 3 zones again, but this time, not with fear or uncertainty. With certainty. With purpose. She drew the paths as veins, connecting chambers, like the pulse of a great body. When she finished, she stepped back and whispered, because they're not lost. They're returning. That afternoon, Professor Whitmore sat in his office, his door closed, his blinds drawn. He hadn't touched his tea. His hands were clasped in front of him as he stared at the copied spiral drawing Ellie had pinned to the chalkboard. He'd waited for her to leave before slipping in and taking it down. He hadn't meant to interfere. But he had to understand. Her drawings weren't just art. They were language. And for the first time in years, Whitmore realized he'd forgotten how to listen to anything that didn't begin with a theorem. He pulled out a folder from his drawer, marked Colotte's conjecture, archive, and laid it beside Ellie's spiral. The comparison wasn't exact. But it didn't need to be. Because her version wasn't trying to solve the conjecture. It was trying to feel it. And it had found something the papers never had. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile. But something softened in his posture. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a professor. He felt like a student. That night, Ellie returned to room 203 under the cover of dusk. She didn't turn on the lights. She just stood in the doorway, feeling the warmth of something still alive in the chalk dust and the quiet hum of meaning. Then she wrote a single phrase beneath the spiral on the board, not chaos. Memory in motion. And as she left the room, she didn't close the door all the way. She left it cracked. Just enough. Because the echo had come. And she wanted it to return. The next morning arrived with a weight Ellie couldn't shake. It wasn't dread exactly, it was the strange heaviness of being seen. Of no longer existing in the quiet shadows between others' routines. When she reached room 203, the door was already ajar. Her pulse quickened. She pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, silent as always, but something was different. The board was untouched. Her spiral remained. Her symbols were still there. But just beneath the words she'd written last night, not chaos. Memory in motion, a new phrase had been added in careful, white chalk, who are you? Her breath caught. It was the first direct question. Not a puzzle. Not a mirror drawing. A question that reached through the wall between observer and participant and asked her to step forward. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She stepped into the room and closed the door gently behind her. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she approached the board, stared at the question, and let it sit in the space between her thoughts. Who was she? A janitor's granddaughter. A girl with ink-stained hands. Someone who hadn't earned a seat but found a way inside anyway. She thought of the math books she'd read in second-hand stores, the hours spent sketching by candlelight when the power was cut, the way people looked through her like she was part of the background. She thought of the professors who never saw her, the exams she would never take, the names she would never be on lists with. Then she reached for the chalk. Her hand hovered. And she wrote, in small letters beneath the question, I'm no one. Then she stepped back and watched the words sit there. Fragile. Honest. A declaration and a wound. For a long time, nothing happened. The room didn't change. The light didn't shift. But something inside her chest did. Because writing it didn't hurt. It clarified. She was no one the world knew. No one the system had prepared for. No one on paper. But she was here. And that meant something. She didn't need permission to matter. Upstairs, Whitmore stood by his office window, watching the bare branches sway in the wind. He hadn't slept well. The spiral had haunted him. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. Not in numbers. In feeling. The patterns Ellie traced, he'd seen them once, long ago, in a notebook he'd kept as a student. It had been dismissed by his advisor. Too poetic. Not rigorous, they'd said. He'd burned the notebook after graduation. And yet now, here it was, reborn through the hands of a girl with no academic history, no credentials, no protection. And somehow, it was more precise than anything he'd ever written. He returned to room 203 in the late afternoon, unsure what he would find. The door was closed, but not locked. He opened it gently and stepped inside. Ellie was gone. But her answer remained. He read the words, I'm no one. He stared at them a long time, then picked up the chalk and underlined them. Not to correct. To emphasize. Because sometimes no one is the only one who can see clearly. That evening, Ruth asked Ellie if she was okay. Ellie didn't answer right away. She stirred her tea and stared at the flickering bulb above their table. Then, quietly, she said, he asked who I was. Ruth paused, her hands resting on the counter. And what did you tell him? I said I'm no one. Ruth turned slowly. And how did that feel? Ellie smiled faintly. Like telling the truth out loud. Whitmore didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office long after the buildings emptied, the campus swallowed in darkness. He kept thinking of her diagrams, her patterns, the way she'd labeled that strange bending point memory. He pulled out an old folder from the bottom of his drawer. Inside were pages he hadn't touched in 20 years. The remnants of a paper he'd abandoned because no one would publish it. He laid Ellie's sketch beside his own, side by side. Not identical, but cousins. Echoes. He saw what she saw. And it terrified him. Because if she was right, the conjecture wasn't a question, it was a mirror. Not meant to be solved, but to be remembered. And no one in the faculty, no one chasing tenure or publication, would want to admit that. The next morning, Ellie returned to room 203 and found a single word beneath her answer. "You're seen." She stood there, staring at it, heart thudding. Then slowly, carefully, she reached for the chalk and wrote below it, "So now what?" Because the silence between them had become a dialogue. And it wasn't finished yet. Ellie's question lingered on the chalkboard for 3 days. So now what? No reply. No new drawings. Just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was the kind that watched. That listened. That waited. Ellie didn't erase the words. She left them, returning each day after her grandmother's shift, refining her diagrams, sketching new paths, exploring divergences where sequences bent in unpredictable ways. The spiral was evolving. New curves appeared between the known points, like tributaries feeding a river no map had charted. She added symbols where the paths hesitated, tiny pauses, like numbers holding their breath before making a decision. She labeled one of them threshold. Another she marked regret. Not because she knew the math behind it, but because that's what it felt like. These weren't just numbers. They were moods. Temperaments. Some sequences moved like they were chasing something. Others moved like they were trying to escape. On Thursday afternoon, Ruth brought home a folded newspaper and laid it on the kitchen table. "Look at clue 18, she said, her smile tucked beneath tired eyes. Ellie unfolded the page, eyes scanning until she found it. It climbs, it pauses, it falls, then returns. Below it, number 27. Her chest tightened. That was her riddle. Her phrasing. Weeks ago, she'd sent it into the local puzzle column without expecting anything. Now it sat in black ink, nestled between grocery coupons and movie listings. Someone at the paper had chosen it. Had read it. Had made it public. And now it was whispering across breakfast tables, into the minds of strangers. For a moment, the room felt too small. Ellie folded the paper again, more gently than she'd expected, and stared out the window at the rust-colored trees trembling in the wind. Something was happening. Not loudly, but undeniably. The next morning, room 203 was different. Not in sound. In smell. The faint scent of dust and coffee lingered near the door. Ellie stepped inside slowly. The board hadn't changed, but a small folded piece of cardboard lay on the floor by the desk. It had been slid under the door, maybe during the night. She picked it up with care. On one side, a sketch, not hers, but using her symbols. A sequence mapped as a single loop, interrupted only once by a sharp, downward arrow. The hinge. Beneath it, someone had written, "The point where decisions change everything." She stared at it, her pulse racing. This wasn't just someone observing her anymore. This was someone interpreting. Building. Joining. She unfolded the cardboard fully. On the inside was a question scrawled in tiny handwriting. "Do you think it's trying to say something?" Ellie didn't sit down. She dropped her bag beside the table, walked to the board, and began drawing with a kind of urgency she hadn't felt before. She rewrote one of her oldest paths, the one that had first caught her attention. Sequence 19. She traced its collapse, its sudden lift, the hesitation at the hinge. Then she added a curve she hadn't dared draw until now. A new branch, splitting from the hinge, rising into empty space. Uncharted. Unfinished. She labeled it with one word, choice. Then she stepped back. The room was utterly quiet, but her breath echoed against the walls. She imagined her watcher, her co-conspirator, standing on the other side of the brick, seeing what she saw. She imagined them staring at that branch and feeling the same thing she did, possibility. Upstairs, Whitmore stood in front of his class, lecturing on combinatorics, but his mind wasn't on permutations or proof strategies. It was on the board in room 203. On the word choice. He had seen it late the night before, after everyone had left. He'd waited until the building was still, then crept down the stairs and opened the door just a crack. What he saw made him lean against the wall like he'd been hit. The drawing. The divergence. The implication. He didn't erase anything. He didn't touch the chalk. He just stood there, staring at the new line, the one that rose beyond the hinge, like a path that refused collapse. That night, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, sketchbook open, drawing quietly while Ruth read a library mystery novel under a knit blanket. "Do you think numbers can want something?" Ellie asked suddenly. Ruth looked up. Want? Like, try to tell us something. Even if we're not asking the right way. Ruth thought for a moment, then nodded. "I think everything wants to be seen. Even numbers. Maybe especially numbers." Ellie didn't reply. She just added a new symbol to the margin of her sketch. A spiral, broken in the middle, with a single arrow rising from the gap. The next day, she left it on the board. No explanation. Just the symbol. A whisper in chalk. A response. And she left the door open an inch wider than usual. Just enough. Because this was no longer a one-way conversation. This was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood, yet. Ellie didn't notice the envelope until she was already halfway through her oatmeal. It was thick, worn at the corners, and had been carefully tucked under the edge of her placemat as if Ruth hadn't wanted to make a big deal of it. Ellie looked up. Ruth met her gaze with a small smile and said, "I thought maybe it's time you saw this." Inside was a single photograph, yellowing and bent, showing a much younger Ruth in a crowded room full of towering bookshelves and cabinets labeled in faded marker, Harvard Archival Reserve. Ruth stood in the center, holding a folder stamped with a red X. Ellie blinked. "You worked in the archive?" 32 years, Ruth said simply. "Before they digitized everything. Before they decided custodians didn't need to know what they were guarding." Ellie turned the photo over. On the back was a date, April 1985. "That was the year they removed Colotte's papers from public catalog," Ruth added, stirring her tea. "They didn't destroy them. Just buried them. And I read them. Every single one." Ellie's breath caught. "Wait. You knew about the conjecture?" "Not by name, back then. Just as, the untamable riddle. It wasn't written like a normal theory. It was full of sketches. Spiral patterns. Marginal notes like dreams. The professors called it dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it made them feel something. And that scared them." Ellie gripped the edge of the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ruth's eyes softened. "Because it's one thing to read a secret. It's another to carry it. I didn't want to load you with someone else's weight. But now, you're drawing the same things I saw. Maybe even further. And you're doing it without knowing what they tried to erase." Ellie sat back, her mind spinning. The spirals. The hinge points. The recurring convergence. She thought she had discovered something new. But it wasn't new, it was rediscovery. A revival. The paper she pulled from the bin that night wasn't trash. It was resurrection. "Do you still have them?" she asked. "The copies?" Ruth nodded. "I kept a few. Hid them in books. You'll find them when you're ready." Ellie didn't finish breakfast. She grabbed her bag and left with a different kind of fire behind her eyes. Not curiosity now. Not awe. Resolve. In room 203, she erased half the board. Not out of frustration, but to make space. She started over. On the left, she wrote, "Memory." On the right, "Erasure." In the middle, she drew her largest spiral yet. But instead of letting it close, she fractured it, 3 breaks, 3 arrows bursting outward. She labeled each branch: knowledge denied, pattern feared, voice unheard. Beneath it, she wrote, repression is a form of proof. Upstairs, Whitmore was in a faculty meeting he hadn't wanted to attend. Discussions of curriculum revisions, grant renewals, textbook endorsements. Words flew past him without meaning. All he could think about was the image Ellie had left on the board, the spiral breaking open, the idea that silence wasn't absence but a kind of evidence. Someone across the table mentioned increasing exam difficulty to weed out underperformers. Whitmore blinked slowly and whispered, or maybe we've just never been listening to the right people. No one heard him. He didn't care. That afternoon, Ellie found the first of the hidden folders. It was tucked inside a forgotten volume of calculus notes in Ruth's closet. Inside were 10 sheets. Drawings. Equations. Comments in the margins that mirrored her own questions. What if convergence isn't the end but the beginning? One page was almost identical to her lattice sketch, only drawn 40 years earlier. She sat on the floor and wept, not out of sadness, but recognition. These weren't the rantings of a madman. They were the thoughts of someone like her. Someone who'd seen beauty in chaos. Someone the system had labeled too poetic to be correct. That night, she brought the pages to room 203 and taped them to the wall beside her own. The room, once empty and cold, now pulsed with energy. Layers of thought. Echoes. Resistance. Ellie didn't draw that night. She sat in silence and let the patterns speak. On the board, she wrote one sentence in bold: this wasn't forgotten. It was hidden. And below it, in smaller print, I'm not here to be polite. I'm here to remember. When she left, she didn't close the door. Not because she forgot. Because she wanted someone else to see. Because the past was no longer buried. It had claws. And it was waking up. They didn't know who she was. Not officially. Not yet. But they'd seen the room. Someone had whispered. A few professors had caught glimpses of the diagrams pinned beside chalk spirals, some drawn in ink that bled from cardboard scraps and notebook pages with frayed edges. The news hadn't spread loud, but it spread sharp, quiet enough to be ignored, strange enough to spark curiosity. One professor had called it graffiti. Another, after one silent visit to room 203, had said, it's not wrong. It was Whitmore who finally gave it a name: convergence mapping. It wasn't a term anyone recognized, and that was exactly the point. When he spoke of it in the faculty lounge, heads turned, not in understanding, but in discomfort. It's intuitive, he said. Not conventional. But it's elegant. A pause. Then came the predictable voice, clipped and cold: is this about that rumor? The janitor's daughter? Granddaughter, Whitmore corrected. And it's not a rumor. That same week, he printed out 6 of Ellie's chalkboard sketches and stapled them to a handout. He didn't label them. Just passed them out during a departmental seminar and waited. The reactions were predictable: furrowed brows, raised eyebrows, an audible scoff, but one hand had hesitated at the edge of the page, tracing the curve of her spiral. A murmured, there's something here. That was all he needed. On Friday, Whitmore called in a favor and booked an unused seminar room with a long oval table and clean white walls. He made no formal announcement, no emails. He just handed out 5 handwritten invitations, each reading, you're invited to a demonstration. Room 414. Friday. 3 p.m. No cameras. No expectations. He handed the 6th to Ruth. Ellie didn't know until an hour before. Whitmore found her in room 203, kneeling by the board, adding a new divergence line shaped like a fracture. He didn't speak at first. Just watched. Then he said, would you show them? She looked up, confused. Who? A few people who still remember what curiosity feels like. She hesitated. They won't believe me. They don't have to. Just let them see. At 2:57 p.m., Ellie stood outside room 414 with her sketchbook in hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear low voices behind the door. She could picture the suits, the polished shoes, the questioning eyes. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the chalk dust. But then Ruth's voice echoed in her memory, "Don't let them make you quiet," and she stepped inside. 6 professors. 2 women, 4 men. All seated. Whitmore stood at the head of the table. No introductions. No applause. He simply said, "This is Ellie Moore. She's the one working on the mappings I showed you." Silence. Then, from the man with the thin glasses and thinner patience, "The spiral sketches?" Whitmore nodded. "They're not just sketches," Ellie said quietly. Her voice surprised even her. "They're motion. Memory. And maps." She stepped forward, opened her notebook to a page marked in ink and graphite, and laid it flat in the center of the table. "These 3 sequences," she said, pointing, "start from opposite directions. 1 climbs. 1 drops. 1 loops. But here," she circled a point, "they all pass through the same hinge." A pause. A hesitation. Then they fall. "A statistical attractor," one professor muttered. "Maybe," Ellie replied, "but I call it a hinge. It's where numbers breathe." A cough. A look exchanged. Then silence. Whitmore stepped back. This wasn't his moment. Ellie turned the page. Another drawing. This one more abstract. Concentric spirals, jagged lines intersecting at chaotic angles, then slowly resolving into curves that spiraled inward. At the center, a broken circle. "This is what happens when paths forget where they began," she said. "But even then, they still try to come home." A pause. Then a voice, low and almost surprised, "That's not wrong." Ellie looked up. It was the professor in the navy blazer. She leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes sharp. "Have you considered modeling this as a topological flow system?" "I don't know what that is," Ellie said. "I just draw what I see." Another silence. But this one felt different. Not dismissal. Curiosity. Whitmore watched them. Their bodies shifted. Not leaning away, leaning in. One man whispered something to his neighbor. Another tapped a finger thoughtfully against the table. Ellie saw it. Felt it. The first crack in the wall. Then the man with the clipboard said, "Who's mentoring her?" Whitmore answered simply, "She's mentoring us." That night, back in the apartment, Ruth poured chamomile tea and placed a new notebook on Ellie's pillow. "For what's coming," she said. Ellie didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. Across campus, in a room once used for faculty debate, 6 minds replayed her diagrams, her voice, her hinge. Not because they understood it yet, but because they couldn't stop seeing it. The spiral had been shown. The door was open. And something had begun. The whispers didn't take long to start. By Monday morning, the seminar room where Ellie had laid out her spirals was already being referred to in hushed tones as the Convergence Showcase. No one used her name. Most didn't know it. But they knew there was a girl, young, unschooled, unexpected, who had drawn something so intricate, so emotionally resonant, that it had left 3 senior professors sitting in silence long after the meeting ended. The ones who weren't there wanted answers. The ones who didn't quite know how to give them. In the faculty lounge, a disagreement broke out over coffee. "It's anecdotal," one said. "Impressionistic. She draws like she's feeling the math, not proving it." "And what if feeling is the proof?" someone else countered. "She didn't use numbers," another muttered. "She mapped emotion." "You can't publish emotion." She mapped convergence. That last voice belonged to the Navy Blazer professor, the one who had said, "That's not wrong." She stirred her tea slowly and added, "And she saw things we've been missing for decades." Whitmore remained quiet. He knew what was coming. Academia didn't like what it couldn't control. The system was built on credentials, papers, approval pipelines. Ellie had none of those. And yet, her work had breached that wall, not with noise, but with elegance. Her spirals had spoken to something deeper than theory. They had stirred memory. And memory, when it returns, demands to be reckoned with. Back in room 203, Ellie continued as she always had. She didn't wait for validation. She wasn't chasing praise. She returned to her chalkboard, now framed in photocopied pages from Ruth's archive, and added a new layer to her mappings. She called it, the veil, the point in a sequence when motion slows so subtly it appears still. A moment before collapse or transformation. A breath held. She drew it as a shimmering line of dots, fading in, fading out, hovering around the hinge. Beneath it, she wrote, "Not an end. A choice disguised as silence." Whitmore saw it that evening. He stood in the doorway, notebook in hand, and whispered, "That's what scared them." Ellie turned. What did? That the pattern might not be random. That it might be waiting for someone brave enough to listen. She didn't reply. She just drew one more arc, gentle, slow, looping back toward the hinge from above. A return, but not the same path. She labeled it, re-entry. The next morning, her drawing was gone. Wiped clean. Her pages pulled from the walls. The spiral erased. At first, she thought she had arrived too late and someone else had claimed the room. But then she saw it, taped to the board where her work had been. A typed note. Clean, official. Room 203 has been reassigned. Access restricted pending departmental review. Faculty only. No signature. No explanation. Just silence, manufactured and delivered. Her hands shook as she pulled the tape loose. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She folded the note carefully, put it in her bag, and walked out of the building without looking back. At home, Ruth waited. She saw Ellie's face before a word was spoken and pulled the girl into her arms. "They erased it," Ellie whispered. "They think that ends it." "It doesn't," Ruth said quietly. "You don't stop a storm by closing the window." That night, Ellie didn't return to Harvard. She returned to the garage behind the laundromat, where boxes of forgotten furniture and unused lamps gathered dust. She swept out the floor, taped plastic over the broken window, and set up a table made from stacked milk crates. Then she opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "They can erase a wall. They can't erase a language." Upstairs, Whitmore opened his email to find an alert, "Access revoked, room 203. He closed the message without responding. He didn't go to the faculty lounge that week. He spent his afternoon staring at a blank chalkboard in his own office, remembering the spirals, the veils, the silence that had held more truth than any proof he'd ever published. In a different wing of campus, a young adjunct asked quietly, "What's your plan with her?" Whitmore didn't hesitate. "To make space before the noise finds her." The adjunct frowned. "You know she'll get torn apart." Whitmore nodded. "That's why I'm listening now. Before the system decides how loud she's allowed to be." Across the city, in a garage that smelled of old oil and chalk dust, Ellie pinned her newest sketch to the wall. 3 spirals, disconnected but moving toward one shared curve. At the center, no labels. Just motion. Just return. No cameras. No signatures. No permission. And yet, it was more real than anything she'd left behind. The room smelled of lemon polish and quiet ambition. 12 chairs arranged in a perfect oval, each occupied by someone with the authority to say no. Whitmore stood just outside the glass-paneled door, arms crossed, eyes watching. He wasn't invited to the meeting, not officially. The agenda read, Review of Academic Irregularities and Unauthorized Use of Facility Resources. The subtext was clearer, contained the anomaly. Inside, the voices were clipped, professional, threaded with that particular brand of intellectual caution that always masks fear. We don't know who let her in. She's not even enrolled. It sets a dangerous precedent. The board wasn't meant for personal projects. She's a child, not a mathematician. One professor, younger than the others and still holding on to the remnants of wonder, cleared her throat. But have you seen the work? Silence. Then another voice, dry and dismissive, pretty drawings don't make theory. No, she said firmly. But theory begins where structure ends. And she's found structure inside chaos. A ripple of discomfort moved across the room. The dean leaned forward. Let's be clear. Are we discussing a discovery, or a distraction? Outside the door, Whitmore clenched his jaw. He'd known this was coming. They weren't rejecting her because they believed she was wrong. They were rejecting her because she hadn't asked for their permission. Because she hadn't waited her turn. Because she made them feel something, and that was more dangerous than any unsolved equation. Down the street, Ellie sat in the far corner of the Widener library, surrounded by books she wasn't allowed to check out. Her hoodie pulled low, her hands ink-stained. She wasn't drawing spirals today. She was sketching faces. Impressions, really. The man with the tired eyes who whispered, "That's not wrong." The woman who blinked twice when Ellie called the hinge a breath. The professor who hadn't looked at her at all. Each one marked with a symbol, a triangle for tension, a loop for curiosity, a jagged arrow for fear. She didn't hate them. She just wanted to understand why seeing her had made them so uncomfortable. When you're used to controlling the story, an unscripted page feels like a threat. Later that evening, Whitmore found her at the garage. He didn't knock. Just opened the door and stepped into the soft glow of a single hanging bulb. Ellie didn't look up from her page. They're going to shut it down, aren't they? He nodded. They've already reassigned the room. So I'm not allowed to think. You're not allowed to think without credentials. And if I don't care about their credentials, then you'll need your own room. He stepped forward, handed her a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't formal. No letterhead. Just a sentence in his handwriting, "There are rooms they can't lock." Ellie stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, "What do I do now?" "You keep going," he said. "And you decide what kind of noise you want to make." The next day, she found a message scrawled on the sidewalk near the old library steps, chalk, half smudged by weather. 4 words, still drawing. I hope so. She didn't know who wrote it. Maybe the adjunct. Maybe the woman with the navy blazer. Maybe no one she'd ever met. But it didn't matter. The echo was growing. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. Someone taped a photocopy of her broken spiral to the department bulletin board. Someone else left a red pin at the intersection point she'd labeled memory. A student posted an anonymous thread online titled "The Girl in Room 203. It went viral. Not because people believed it, but because it felt true. The spiral wasn't just a shape now. It was a rumor. A rebellion. A reminder. Inside the committee room, someone finally said it out loud, "Even if we block her, the idea is out." There were no claps. No cheers. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something had slipped through their fingers, and it was still moving. That night, Ruth came into the garage carrying a tray with peanut butter toast and warm milk. She didn't ask what Ellie was working on. She just looked at the walls covered in paper and loops and eyes and arcs, nodded once, and said, "You named it yet?" Ellie smiled. Not yet. It doesn't want a name yet. Ruth placed a hand on her shoulder. Then it's still growing. And so was she. Not in a classroom. Not in a journal. In the space they hadn't planned for. The place they forgot to control. The quiet between rejection and return. Where all the best revolutions begin. The garage didn't look like much from the outside, a sagging roof, cracked windows, a rusted-out lock that Ellie had long since replaced with a bent nail and wire loop. But inside, it had become something else. Not a refuge. Not a studio. Something harder to define. It didn't have walls covered in paint or inspiration quotes. It had diagrams, notes layered over other notes, sequences scribbled on cardboard backs of cereal boxes, equations tangled with emotion. There was no desk, just a folding table scavenged from Ruth's closet, and no chair except for a pair of upside-down crates Ellie had stacked into a makeshift seat. But it had light. A single yellow bulb strung from a hook on the ceiling, humming like it knew a secret. And now, it had a name. Not spoken aloud. Not written on any sign. But it had one just the same. The room with no name. Because Ellie didn't want it to be claimed. Not by the university, not by the press, not even by herself. Naming it would let someone else own it. And this room wasn't about ownership. It was about freedom. It was about remembering what had almost been lost. Whitmore visited on Tuesday. No formal plan, no invitation. Just a knock against the frame and a quiet, "You busy?" Ellie looked up from her sketchbook. Not yet. Come in. He stepped inside carefully, eyes sweeping over the walls like a pilgrim entering a temple he wasn't sure he deserved to be in. You've been busy. She shrugged. I had to rebuild. They wiped everything from the board. They can't wipe it from here. That's the point. He moved closer to the far wall, where she'd mapped what she now called the redirection. A series of sequences that looped but didn't return. They curved, flirted with collapse, but then, just before falling into the hinge, veered sideways. She'd traced them with red marker, labeled each one with emotion, doubt, defiance, escape. He stared at them for a long time. This isn't resolution. No, Ellie said, it's resistance. He nodded slowly. And it changes the whole map. Because it's not supposed to be a trap, she said. It's a choice. The spiral wants to return, but not all of us do. Some of us find a way to break free. Whitmore turned, met her eyes. You think numbers can want something? No, she said, but people do. And sometimes we build our math to mirror our hopes. Or our cages. He didn't argue. Instead, he sat beside her on a crate, unfolded a paper from his coat pocket, and handed it to her. I found this in an old seminar transcript. 1979, Colotte's last recorded lecture. It was never published. Ellie unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was chaotic, half-legible, scrawled between printed lines. At the bottom, one phrase had been underlined twice. The spiral is not a prison. It's an invitation. Ellie stared at the words. Her breath caught. He saw it. He did. But he couldn't say it in a way they were willing to hear. Then I'm not alone. You never were. You just didn't know we were listening yet. That night, Ellie added the quote to her wall. Beneath it, in her own hand, she wrote, No one gets to rename this. She stepped back and stared at the words, then circled them in thick, black ink. Not as a decoration. As a boundary. Because she knew what was coming. There were meetings. Articles. Whispers. The faculty had started using phrases like potential integration and structured mentorship. They were circling. Not out of kindness, but out of instinct. They didn't understand what she was doing. They just knew it was drawing attention. And in their world, attention had to be managed. She received her first invitation that Friday, typed, sealed, delivered to her mailbox in a stiff white envelope with the Harvard seal pressed into the corner. We would like to formally invite you to a discussion regarding the academic direction and potential institutional collaboration concerning your recent work. Ellie held the envelope like it was radioactive. Ruth read it, then folded it and said, "They'll try to name it." Ellie nodded. "I know. Will you go?" "Maybe. But I'm not going to answer their questions." "What will you do?" Ellie looked toward the wall where her spirals pulsed with quiet fire. "I'll ask my own." She turned back to Ruth. "And I won't let them forget who asked first." That weekend, Whitmore warned her gently. "They'll want to include you, then reshape you." "I'm not here to be shaped," Ellie said. "I'm here to remember what they erased." He nodded. "Then you better make sure the room stays yours." Ellie smiled, walked to the chalkboard she dragged in last month from a curbside pile, and began to draw again. Not to explain. Not to convince. Just to remind the world, some rooms were never meant to be labeled. And this one, this room with no name, was where the spiral had learned how to breathe. It happened in the middle of the night, the way all quiet revelations do, not with thunder or spotlight, but with a single sharp breath at the edge of sleep. Ellie sat up in bed, heart racing, the ceiling flickering with passing headlights from the street below. She didn't know what had woken her exactly, only that her mind was spinning with a new image, one she hadn't drawn before. It wasn't a spiral. It wasn't a line. It was an opening. A breach in the loop. A space between the paths that had never been there before, not in any of her mappings. She threw off the blanket, grabbed her sketchbook from the floor, and knelt beside the nightstand to draw it. The curve arched like a usual sequence, but midway through it stalled, not at the hinge, not at the lattice, but in the space between them. A pause so full it felt like presence. She circled it. She didn't know why. She just knew it meant something. A place where the pattern waited, not to collapse or redirect, but to be heard. She stared at the shape for a long time, then slowly wrote beneath it, "What if this isn't a formula? What if it's a message?" At the garage the next day, she redrew the shape 10 times. Each time, she started at a different point, used a different number, tried a different rhythm. But every path eventually curved toward the breach, hovered, then dropped. Not all from the same angle, not all with the same speed. But always that moment, like a breath being held. She called it the still point. And when she finally stepped back, she saw what she hadn't seen before. In every previous drawing, the sequences had seemed like travelers rushing toward collapse. But now, they looked like signals, repeating themselves not to return, but to be recognized. She grabbed a clean sheet of paper and began listing the traits she'd seen in the paths that paused at the still point. Irregular deceleration. Curve softening. Triple recurrence. And the strangest of all, every sequence that passed through it echoed one previously mapped. Not exactly. Not numerically. But in shape. In tone. Like memory playing back a theme in a different key. Whitmore visited that afternoon. She didn't speak when he entered. Just handed him the sheet and watched his eyes as he read. He didn't blink for a long time. Then he whispered, "It's mimicking. Or communicating," Ellie said. "There's structure. Recursion. Echo. That's not possible. But it's happening." He sat down hard on the crate, ran a hand through his hair. "If it's a message, then what language is it using?" "Not one we've been taught," Ellie said. "But maybe one we remember." Whitmore stood and walked to the wall. The drawings loomed around him like constellations. "Do you think Colott knew?" "Maybe he felt it," Ellie said. "But I don't think he saw it all. Not like this. Not from the outside and the inside at the same time. That evening, Ellie copied the drawing of the still point again, this time layering translucent paper over it, adding new paths, letting them fold and blur. The result was a shape that didn't resemble math anymore. It looked like breath. Like a heartbeat drawn sideways. She held it up to the light, and through it, she could see her own reflection staring back. It wasn't about solving. It never had been. The message wasn't in the numbers. It was in the motion. The recurrence. The return. Not of data. Of self. Later that week, she added a note to the garage door. Not to keep people out, but to remind herself what this place had become. It read: "If this is a message, we must listen with more than reason. We must listen with memory." Across campus, behind a door marked Advanced Theory and Applications, 3 professors stood around a table scattered with copies of Ellie's latest diagrams. One of them pointed to the drawing of the still point. "She doesn't know what she's on to." "She doesn't need to," another said. "Just let us study the structure." "What if she asks for credit?" "She won't," the third muttered. "She thinks this is about truth. Not tenure." In the garage, Ellie sat under the yellow bulb, flipping through an old notebook, and stopped at a page from weeks ago, the first time she had drawn the hinge. Back then, she'd thought it was the center. Now she knew better. It wasn't the center. It was the door. The place. The message slowed down, looked back, waited to be noticed. She added one final line beneath the sketch: "Maybe we're not the first to ask. Maybe we're just the first to hear it this way." And with that, she turned the page, knowing the next one had to be blank, not because she had nothing left to draw, but because the message hadn't finished saying what it came to say. He stood outside the garage for a long time, holding nothing but a folded piece of paper and an umbrella he didn't need. The sky above was the kind of gray that promised rain but never delivered, and Whitmore wasn't sure if he felt like an intruder or a supplicant. He had thought about this moment for weeks. Every time he traced the patterns Ellie had drawn, every time he closed his eyes and saw the still point replaying itself like a skipped record in a cosmic song, he'd felt the tug. Not just to understand, but to answer for something. Because he had been the one who threw the question away. He had been the hand that crumpled the page, the authority that declared it unsolvable, unworthy, unfit. And now, here he was, at the door of the girl who had rescued it. He knocked once. Not hard. Not timid. Just enough. Inside, Ellie looked up from her sketchbook. She knew who it was before she opened the door. There was a kind of gravity that came with regret, and she could feel it pressing gently against the frame. She didn't speak as she pulled the door open. Whitmore stood there, slightly damp, eyes tired, paper in hand. "You came," she said softly. "I waited until it felt like the room wanted me." She stepped aside, and he entered, slowly, like stepping onto holy ground. His eyes scanned the walls, maps, sketches, echoes of spirals once erased. It was all here. Preserved. Transformed. Ellie led him to the far side of the garage, where a new series had been pinned. She pointed to one in particular, a diagram that began with a standard path, only to split at the hinge, rise, and curve into a direction no other path had followed. It didn't collapse. It diverged. "This one's new," she said. "I found it while reworking my hinge points. Some sequences don't meet in the same place, but they still turn at the same angle. Like they're remembering a rhythm they've never heard." Whitmore stared at it, the silence stretching, then whispered, "It's the first exit ramp I've ever seen from a deterministic loop." "Or the first entrance to something else," Ellie replied. She pointed to the overlapping curves beside it, ones that never intersected, yet seemed to pull toward a shared direction. "I call this, the room that redirects." Whitmore stepped closer, studying the shapes. They weren't just equations anymore. They were invitations. Like the numbers themselves were gently guiding the observer toward a thought rather than a solution. You understand what this means, don't you? He said, voice low. If this holds, if this isn't coincidence, it could reframe how we see collapse entirely. Or it could just be a mirror, Ellie said. Showing us how we move, how we pause, how we choose. Not everything needs to be an answer. Some things are just reflections. They sat down on the crate stools, the air between them thick with understanding. Ellie poured tea, weak but warm. Whitmore took the first sip, then leaned forward. There's going to be pressure again. Probably louder this time. They'll want papers. Proofs. Names. Affiliations. Ellie nodded. I know. What if you say no? She looked up at him, eyes clear, voice steady. Then I say no. But not out of fear. I say no because I know it's worth saying yes to something else. He smiled at that, quiet, worn, genuine. It's not a theory yet, she said, gesturing to the walls, to the spiral still breathing through every curve. It's a language still learning how to say thank you. Whitmore reached into his coat and unfolded the paper he had brought. He handed it to her. It wasn't a letter of endorsement. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Handwritten. No logos. No seals. Just 6 words, you may speak if you wish. Beneath that, a note in his script, we'll be meeting in the North Rotunda. It won't be recorded. It won't be published. But the room will be listening. You're not required. You're simply welcome. Ellie held the paper like it might vanish. No one had ever asked her to speak like this before. Not as a problem to be fixed. But as a voice to be heard. She didn't give an answer then. She didn't need to. The message had already landed. Later, after Whitmore left and the street fell quiet, Ellie hung a new page on the wall. It was blank except for one line in the corner. What happens after silence is here. And beneath it, in the smallest letters she could write, she added, it listens. The room was tall and circular, its ceiling painted with constellations most people never looked up to notice. North Rotunda, quiet, tucked away behind 3 layers of offices, a space forgotten by anyone who didn't already know its corners. Ellie stood just inside the threshold, gripping her notebook like it might disappear if she loosened her hold. There were no cameras. No microphones. Just a dozen chairs arranged in a loose semicircle, and a soft-spoken woman in a navy blazer waiting by the far wall. She nodded once, then stepped aside. Whenever you're ready, she said. No podium. No formal introduction. No slideshow. Just silence, the kind that didn't press, didn't judge, but simply waited. Ellie crossed the floor, every step echoing slightly. She reached the center, then stopped. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. She opened her notebook and flipped to the last page. The one she'd finished at 3:17 that morning. The sketch was a spiral, but not like the others. This one was open-ended, incomplete by design. It bent outward instead of inward, like it was trying to leave the page. At the center, she had written one word, still. She held it up. No one spoke. No one moved. Then she turned the page. The second drawing showed multiple curves, all approaching the same invisible point, but never touching it. Beneath that, her handwriting read, if you only measure what moves, you'll miss the thing that holds it all still. A few of the professors leaned forward. One exhaled, almost involuntarily. Ellie didn't explain. She placed the notebook gently on the chair in front of her and stepped back. That was her presentation. No defense. No theorem. Just a shape and a sentence. Just silence given form. Someone in the room whispered, she's not here to be understood. She's here to remind us what we forgot. Another muttered, it's not a proof. It's a presence. The woman in the navy blazer stood and approached the notebook. She didn't touch it. Just looked at it as though it might say more if left undisturbed. Then, quietly, she said, "You've built a language worth waiting for." Ellie met her eyes but didn't smile. She wasn't there to be congratulated. She was there to offer a map. Behind her, someone had written a line in chalk on the board: "This seat has no name, but whoever sits here will not be interrupted." No one clapped. No one recorded. But every person left that room slower than they'd entered, like something had adjusted inside them and they weren't quite sure how to carry it yet. Back in the garage, Ellie hung a new page beside the others. A simple line sketch showing one curve bending just enough to avoid the spiral entirely. She called it the first listener. Ruth climbed the stairs with a tray of warm milk and toast and said, "How was it?" Ellie didn't look up from her sketchbook. They listened. Did they understand? Not all of it. But some of them felt it. "That's enough for now," Ruth said, placing the tray beside her. "The rest will catch up when they're ready." Ellie nodded. She didn't need applause. She didn't need translation. She just needed space. And the spiral, broken, breathing, infinite, was finally hers to speak. It started with a knock on the garage door, sharp and too early for comfort. Ellie blinked the sleep from her eyes, pulled on a hoodie, and cracked the door open. A man in a dark jacket stood there, holding a clipboard and smiling like he'd practiced in a mirror. "Miss Moore?" he asked, though he clearly already knew. "I'm from the Office of Scholarly Outreach. We'd love to schedule a follow-up. A presentation. Maybe a workshop." Ellie stared at him. He went on, talking about donors, visibility, possibly a video series. "You've stirred real interest. There's buzz. Everyone's curious. This could be huge, book deals, speaking tours." She closed the door. Not rudely. Just firmly enough to return the silence. The buzz didn't stop. That week, 3 emails arrived from publishers. A local news station left a message with Ruth, asking for an interview. Someone posted a grainy photo of her spiral on social media, and within a day, the thread had 5,000 comments. Most were curious. Some were cruel. A few asked if she'd even drawn it herself. "I knew it," Ruth muttered one night as they folded laundry. The minute the truth starts speaking, everyone either wants to own it or drown it. Ellie didn't reply. Her sketches had started to change. They were less fluid, more defensive. She found herself second-guessing her curves, wondering if someone would call them amateur, wondering what it meant when her symbols were misquoted online. People were no longer seeing the patterns. They were seeing her. And the spiral, once a quiet whisper in chalk, was now an argument in a dozen voices. One night, she returned to the garage and found a package slipped under the door. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with her name engraved on the cover. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. There was a card tucked inside, courtesy of the Newton Collective. "Let's shape your brilliance together." She tore it in half. Whitmore visited the next day. He found her pacing the garage, furious in the quiet way only thinkers burn, no shouting, no stomping, just an intensity that made the air taste like electricity. "They want the spiral," she said. "They don't care what it means. They just want to say it's theirs." Whitmore nodded. "That's how institutions survive. They absorb what they fear. Then rename it until no one remembers it was ever wild." Ellie turned to him. "What if I don't want to be part of it?" "Then don't be. But if I walk away, they'll take the spiral anyway. They'll water it down, flatten it. Call it a learning tool. Then make it too alive to contain." She stared at the wall, at the drawings that no longer felt like secrets. What if they change what it is? They can't. Not if you keep drawing it. The spiral doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the moment someone sees it and knows. That night, Ellie took down half her sketches. Not to hide them, but to breathe. She left only 3 on the wall, the original spiral, the hinge, and the still point. She stood back and stared at the space they left behind. It felt open again. Like possibility. She drew a new path, slow and careful, a single line that began at the edge of the spiral and moved away, not escaping, just diverging. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is not a performance. It's a conversation. I speak." The spiral answers. The next morning, she posted a scanned image of that sketch on an anonymous account. No name. No bio. No hashtags. Just the drawing. Within hours, the post had been shared across physics forums, design blogs, even a meditation group. The comments weren't asking who made it. They were asking what it meant. And for the first time in weeks, Ellie smiled. Because now the spiral wasn't hers. And that was exactly how it was meant to be. She turned down the invitation. No cameras. No TED-style stage. No panel discussion moderated by people who had never touched chalk or waited in silence to feel a thought unfold. They offered her a platform. She offered them a boundary. "I don't want to explain it," she told Whitmore, the words calm, even. "I want to let it speak." "They won't like that," he replied. "I know. They'll call it arrogance." "Let them." They sat in the garage together, not as mentor and student, but as 2 people who had seen something strange and beautiful emerge from the forgotten corners of thought. Ellie had stopped expanding the spiral. She had stopped adding layers, stopped chasing new sequences. Instead, she stared at the ones already drawn. She copied them again and again, not to improve them, but to understand how they changed every time she looked. The spiral didn't shift. She did. One evening, she found herself staring at a point in the lattice that had always felt like noise, a jagged dip, a double-back loop she used to skip over. But now, in stillness, she saw it differently. It wasn't an error. It was a hesitation. A moment of refusal in the pattern, as if the sequence was saying, "I could collapse now, but I won't." She circled it and labeled it, defiance. Not rebellion. Not chaos. Just stillness that refused to be rushed. That week, more letters arrived. Offers, not questions. "We'd love to feature your work. Let us help you scale it. You're a prodigy." She didn't reply to any of them. She wasn't angry. Just quiet. Just still. At night, Ruth watched her granddaughter stare at pages for hours without drawing a line. "You okay?" she asked once. Ellie nodded. "I'm listening." "To what?" "To what happens when I stop talking." On the edge of campus, in a basement classroom that hadn't been used in months, someone had written on the whiteboard, "She chose not to come." So the spiral did. Students started sneaking into the garage when Ellie wasn't there, quietly leaving notes. Some drew their own spirals. Some copied hers. One left a post-it on the crate table that read, "I didn't know numbers could feel like forgiveness." Ellie found them all. She kept them in a shoebox. She didn't display them. She didn't need to. One day, she received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten, "Some things don't grow louder. They grow deeper." Beneath it, a sketch. Her spiral, drawn in red thread. Not ink. Not chalk. Thread sewn into paper, curve by curve, loop by loop. She traced the stitch with her fingertip. A spiral that had no voice, but still knew how to speak. That night, Ellie drew one last version of the hinge. A smaller one. Simpler. It didn't diverge. It didn't collapse. It just hovered. A perfect curve suspended mid-thought. She stared at it for a long time. Then she labeled it with a word she'd never used before, faith. Because sometimes, the choice wasn't to fight or flee. It was to be still. To let the world rush around you, while you held your shape. Not as resistance. As truth. When she pinned that drawing to the center of the wall, Ruth stepped into the garage and said, "That one feels quiet." Ellie smiled. "It is. It's the moment before the next thing begins." "And what's that?" Ellie didn't answer. She didn't know yet. She didn't have to. The spiral was still listening. And so was she. The morning air was brittle, laced with frost that hadn't quite turned to dew. Ellie sat cross-legged on the garage floor, the warmth of the yellow bulb above her casting shadows in familiar arcs across the sketches. She wasn't drawing today. She was rereading. Page by page, spiral by spiral, she let her eyes follow the lines she'd once made with certainty, now unsure whether they'd emerged from intuition or accident. But they still spoke. Not in answers, but in echoes. She stared longest at the drawing she had labeled Faith. The curve that neither rose nor fell. The one that simply paused and hovered. The one that hadn't demanded to be named until the silence named it for her. That day, she didn't leave the garage. She didn't eat lunch. She didn't look at her phone, even though Ruth had slipped it beside her with a quiet warning, "They're asking again." Faculty. Journalists. Someone from a documentary team. Ellie didn't reply. She just held the pen like a promise and returned to the sequence that had begun this whole thing, sequence 27. The number she'd pulled from the trash. The number she'd watched collapse, rise, twist, then collapse again. But today, she noticed something new. Not in the steps. In the rhythm. The pauses between iterations. The places where the pattern hesitated, not mechanically, but emotionally. It was the rhythm of someone rethinking, of motion catching its breath. And in that moment, Ellie knew. It wasn't just the path that mattered. It was the silence between steps. That night, she sketched a new shape, not a spiral, not a hinge, not even a curve. It was a gap. A blank space drawn deliberately in the center of her page, bordered by ghost trails of abandoned paths. Beneath it, she wrote, "What silence sounds like." She pinned it to the wall, center stage, and left everything else untouched. Outside, the sky had turned to glass, the moon sharp enough to slice through thought. Ruth found her asleep on the crate, sketchbook on her lap, one hand still curled around a pen. She covered her with a blanket, not saying a word, and turned off the bulb. The next morning, room 203's chalkboard bore a new message. No one claimed to have written it. No security footage caught the act. But someone had returned. In clean, deliberate strokes, the board read, "This seat has no name, but whoever sits here will not be interrupted." The campus didn't make an announcement. But the room stayed unlocked. Unclaimed. And every few days, new drawings appeared. Not many. Just one or two. Quiet things. Spirals. Arcs. Echoes. Ellie never visited the room again. She didn't need to. Her silence had made its mark. At the garage, she added one last sketch to the wall. It was small, nearly invisible, drawn in faded gray pencil. A spiral that broke at the center, but instead of closing, it folded outward. A divergence that didn't escape, just opened. She labeled it, "Listening is the shape of surviving." Then she sat back and let the wall speak for itself. She wasn't waiting for applause. She wasn't waiting for the world to understand. She had offered the spiral its voice. And now, in stillness, it was learning how to sing. She invited no one. No press, no professors, no panels. The invitation, if it could be called that, was a folded piece of paper slid quietly beneath the faculty office door of a man who once threw a question away. It read only, "If you still want to see, come tomorrow. The room will be ready." When Whitmore arrived the next morning, he wasn't sure what he expected. A formal presentation, maybe. A last spiral drawn with dramatic flair. But the garage was silent, the kind of silence that hummed. The door was slightly ajar. He stepped inside, careful not to let his footsteps disturb whatever was already awake within. Ellie stood near the far wall, hands smudged with graphite, eyes calm. Around her were the drawings, but something had changed. The spirals were still there, the hinges, the defiant turns, but now they were joined by something else. Paths that didn't loop. Curves that never crossed. Lines that left the page entirely. You didn't name them, Whitmore said quietly. Ellie shook her head. They don't want names. They want to be seen. He moved toward the center of the room and stopped in front of a table where a single sketchbook lay open. The drawing was simple. A spiral at first glance, but upon closer inspection, the curve didn't bend inward. It broke at its midpoint and arched back out, as though the pattern had chosen to reverse itself mid-collapse. Beneath it, she had written, "The final curve doesn't close. It listens. Then redirects." Whitmore stared at it, feeling something in his chest shift. "It's not the end." "No," Ellie said. "It's the moment after." "After what?" "After we stop pretending we know what we're solving for." He turned to her. "Why show me?" "Because you asked. And now? Now I make room." She walked past him, slow and deliberate, to the center of the garage. There, she pulled aside a curtain that had been pinned to the back wall. Behind it wasn't a new drawing. It was a mirror. Not clean. Not polished. A fragment of one that had been cracked long ago and pieced back together. She stepped aside. Whitmore saw himself, distorted, reflected through curves and glass. Around the mirror's edge, Ellie had written phrases. Fragments from Colotte's lost notes. Words she'd once whispered to herself when no one listened. The path bends before it breaks. Not all divergence is defiance. To collapse is not to fail. And finally, at the very bottom, you may speak if you wish. Whitmore stood there a long time. Not speaking. Just seeing. Behind him, Ellie began taking down the pages. Not to erase them. To archive them. She placed each one gently into a box marked unfinished. Ruth watched from the doorway, silent as always, her presence a constant gravity. Ellie moved with care, her hands steady. She left one drawing on the wall, the first spiral. Not because it was her best, but because it had started the listening. Then she turned to Whitmore. "It's yours now." The room. The question. The echo. "Will you stop drawing?" he asked. She smiled, faint and wide. "I'll stop sharing. For a while. Let it breathe." Outside, the wind shifted. A soft breeze moved through the open crack of the garage door. Ellie picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and nodded once. Then she stepped outside without looking back. Whitmore remained inside, the pages still humming with the quiet momentum of meaning. He approached the wall, picked up the chalk, and beneath the spiral, he wrote one line. She didn't answer the question. She changed it. In the days that followed, no announcement was made. No awards given. But in rooms across campus and beyond, sketches began to appear. Spirals in the margins of notebooks, hinge points scribbled on whiteboards, still points whispered in code. Not because they were trending. Because they had been heard. And somewhere far from the noise, in a room with no name, a blank page waited, not to be filled, but to be honored. The spiral, after all, had never asked to be solved. Only seen.